All right, folks, back in the FITSNews studio for another edition of your Week in Review. We've got some breaking news in one of the key cases linked to the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga, and we've also got some breaking barbs that have been thrown in the Murdoch soap opera, I'm calling it. You've got two things here, folks. You got real news and you got some drama going on. We're going to talk about both of them in this section because I got dragged into that drama a little bit. We're also going to dig into a big scandal that came and went 3 years ago up in Greenville, South Carolina, the Thornblade story. There's been some news this week that could put that saga back on the radar in a big way. We're going to tell you all about what happened 3 years ago and why what happened this past week could lead to a break in that case. And last but not least, a metric ton of political news, particularly 2024 presidential news. We're going to break it down as it relates to Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and South Carolina's own Tim Scott. A lot of news to hit you with. All of it coming your way right now on the Week in Review. So we're going to start this week with some news on the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption front, although I will say it's still not entirely evident just how connected this story that we're about to talk about is to that Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. I'm referring, of course, to the 2015 homicide of Stephen Smith of Hampton, South Carolina. Smith's body, of course, found in the middle of Sandy Run Road near Crocketville, South Carolina, the early morning hours of July 8, 2015. This has been a cold case mystery for the last 8 years. However, it's been the last few years where we have seen just an explosion of national and even international interest in the Smith case, especially after it was featured in that Netflix documentary, Murdoch Murders, A Southern Scandal. But before we get to the questions about the proximity of the Smith case to the Murdochs, some important developments. As we reported just yesterday, we have been able to confirm that the South Carolina statewide grand jury is indeed investigating Stephen Smith's death as a homicide. They are receiving testimony. They are reviewing evidence. That means subpoenas and warrants have been issued. That also means that Smith family attorney Eric Bland was correct back on March 25th when he spoke with Court TV and indicated that he believed a grand jury had been impaneled in this case. Bland was absolutely right. A grand jury indeed was impaneled. Now, we do not know exactly how far in their deliberations that grand jury is at this point. We do, however, know that the grand jury will be convening this coming week, second full week of June. They will be, again, hearing additional testimony and evidence. Now, what have they heard so far? According to our sources who are close to this process, grand jurors have received evidence which indicates, or according to our sources, proves conclusively that Smith's body was found where he was killed. In other words, that Smith was not killed at another location and brought to Sandy Run Road, but in fact he died there on the spot where his body was found by that tow driver at 4 a.m. in the morning on July 8. Now, this is very significant. And according to our sources, it's been confirmed not only by state investigators, but also by Dr. Kenneth Kinsey. And if you recall, Kinsey, he was one of the star witnesses at the Alec Murdoch double homicide trial back in March of this year. He was also hired by Smith's family and by attorneys Bland and Ronnie Richter as they have investigated Smith's homicide. And according to my sources, Kinsey has confirmed that, yes, Stephen Smith, in fact, died where his body was found on that summer morning nearly 8 years ago. Now, as this case continues to unfold, as my news outlet has previously reported, there are two persons of interest that officers, or agents rather, with the State Law Enforcement Division have focused in on. Two persons of interest, Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. Now, these are both 25-year-old young men from Brunson, South Carolina. They lived in the area where this tragedy occurred 8 years ago, and they have been linked to it by none other than Randy Murdoch. In fact, if you followed our case files back earlier this year, we dumped a ton of case files on the Stephen Smith investigation on our website. You can review that. Just Google FITSNews, Stephen Smith for those. But a ton of case files, and it was abundantly clear from looking at those files that these two persons of interest were the result of Murdoch direction. In other words, they were on the radar of law enforcement officers due to a tip from the Murdoch family. Now, we know that Sandy Smith made it abundantly clear her belief that the Murdochs were involved in the death of her son. She made that abundantly clear in a letter that was sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2016, in which she pointed the finger at the Murdochs and specifically at Buster Murdoch. Now, that created a buzz that has just grown into a cacophony over the last 7 years. In fact, it got to the point that Buster Murdoch issued a statement in the weeks after his father's conviction on the double homicide charges and the death of his mom and younger brother. Buster Murdoch actually came out with a statement denying any involvement, disavowing the rumors related to his alleged involvement in the death of Stephen Smith. And I want to be clear, at this point, none of the investigations into Stephen Smith's death have come anywhere near Buster Murdoch. Anywhere near. Not within a country mile, people. And in fact, one of the things that's a little troubling about this case is when investigators working for Sandy Smith back in 2021, when they determined that there did not appear to be any connection between Buster Murdoch and this just savage murder, Sandy Smith actually fired him. Fired him. So, again, we're glad that there's a break in this case. We're glad that we seem to be moving more toward justice, but it is important, as I've said from the beginning of the Stephen Smith story, of the Alec Murdoch story, to let facts and evidence govern our discussion. Not emotion, not personalities, and not picking one team versus another. So that leads us into the next little bit of Murdoch news. It was a busy and very dramatic week with the Murdoch soap opera, because again, I distinguish here. We've got an investigation into this corrupt family that's, again, lorded its power over the people of the Palmetto Low Country for decades. We've got that. But then we've also got this cottage industry that's sort of popped up in the name of exposing it, in the name of truth and justice surrounding it. And what we've seen in recent weeks, in the aftermath of the double homicide trial, which again was really the big moment in this case, what we've seen in the aftermath of that is sort of I don't know if you want to call it clinging for relevance, or I don't know what we want to call it, but I had a lot of people ask me during the Murdoch trial, what are you guys going to do when this is over? And my response was pretty simple. We're going to go back to doing what we've been doing. We're just holding folks accountable in South Carolina, holding the court system accountable. In fact, we've been doing that with a vengeance in the aftermath of the Murdoch trial, whether it's that big Jared Price case, the convicted killer and gang leader. We exclusively reported on that, have been driving that story. But yeah, that's what we're doing. Same thing we've been doing before and during the Murdoch story. But as this thing has unfolded, what we've seen, first of all, I want to talk about the prosecutorial pissing match. I think that's what Sarah Azari said on her Twitter feed. She's absolutely right. Absolutely right. There is huge discord right now between state and federal prosecutors in the aftermath of last month's indictment of Alec Murdoch on federal charges. According to my sources, lead state prosecutor Creighton Waters is up in arms, irate. He's been accusing the feds of a couple things. Number one, of stealing his work, of basically saying that the federal indictments were based on work that was done by state prosecutors. Now, the feds have fired back, claiming that Waters lied to them. They have claimed that the state was going to take the murder case and some of these other criminal matters, but they were going to leave the financial crimes to the feds. And the back chatter through our federal contacts, they claim that Creighton Waters double-crossed them. Now, I don't know who's telling the truth, but you've got these allegations flying back and forth. And another thing Waters apparently confided to some sources that spoke with us, indicated he believed that the federal prosecutors were not looking for justice in the Murdoch case and weren't even really looking to cut a deal with the Murdoch prosecutors regarding potential federal time in the event Alec Murdoch's murder convictions were overturned, but that they were looking for publicity, that they were looking for attention, and that was what was motivating them. So yeah, prosecutors are not exactly singing off the same sheet of the music, but that soap opera, that's one of our soap operas. If you change the channel and go over to the civil side, You got an even better soap opera going there, and it's one I actually got dragged into a little bit this week. We're going to talk about that now. This is the drama involving the civil lawyers in this case. And I do want to back it up. Netflix didn't air this. But back in the fall of 2021, when I gave my first sit-down interview with the folks at Netflix for their big documentary, I told them, I said, you guys watch these lawyers closely. And don't assume that anybody in this case is wearing a white hat. Because as I've said over and over and over again on this show, it is not truth and justice driving people. A lot of people in this case. It is self-interest. It is money. It is ego. It is Twitter followers. That is the fuel of the Murdoch story right now, unfortunately. And you see that in the back and forth between these lawyers / podcasters, because they're on, you got Eric Bland's on a podcast, you got Jim Griffin starting a podcast, and that's great. A lot of those do great work. But we're in a space now where we've got these competing egos and these competing media, personalities going back and forth at each other, sniping in these court filings, which have become increasingly bizarre. There was a filing submitted just this past week by Eric Bland, and this is in one of the civil cases where, again, he's, to my knowledge, in no danger of losing any of the money that he and his law firm have won in connection with these Murdoch cases. Look, as I've always said, they did good work. And all these folks that are claiming that they're going to lose this money because Alec Murdoch has now been exposed as lying about some of the circumstances surrounding their payouts, I don't think you can put that toothpaste back in the tube, and I've always said that. But this week, things got a little crazy. We wrote an article laying out Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter's response to the Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin filing in that big case, the Gloria Satterfield case. This, of course, the housekeeper who died. Again, another mysterious death, somehow linked to the Murdochs. But this was, from all indications, an accident, a fall. One that Alec Murdoch concocted a story, got his family on board with it, sold the story to insurance investigators, and used it to defraud two insurance companies out of millions of dollars. Millions of dollars. And back in October 2021, Eric Bland knew that there were doubts about this story. In fact, he expressed those doubts, as was reported in our coverage back in October 2021. But now all of a sudden we are to believe that the one and only time Alec Murdoch ever told the truth was in an instance that benefited Bland and Richter to the tune of, again, several $1 million. Don't begrudge them for making that money. Don't begrudge them for advocating on behalf of their client. But I do take issue with this belief that we cannot objectively assess the arguments that are being put forward. Because there's an important part of this. Eric Bland has been accused by Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin during that process of scoring some of that money, or at least a confession of judgment in the amount of $4.3 million, by leveraging their activism in front of a judge, by agreeing to tone down what they said in front of a judge regarding Alec Murdoch's bond. And Harpootlian and Griffin have claimed that's misconduct, and Bland and Richter, frankly, don't have a very good answer for that. But again, we've got to be able to talk about this without people flying off the handle. And, Bland, I'm going to pull this up here on the social media here on Twitter. He got very upset by this, talking about how we're hitting below the belt and attacking them for. It's like, no, nobody's attacking you guys. It's calling balls and strikes, and the problem with this story is that when you are unable to call balls and strikes on all sides, when one side is so excessively butthurt, irrationally butthurt, how do you, I don't know. But that's the space that this story has gone. And it's the same space the Stephen Smith story has gone, because, as I said, we have moved out of the realm of investigatory journalism and of critical thinking. And we've moved into the realm of rumors and tweets, people. Rumors and tweets. And again, money and ego. Has this news outlet done well on the Murdochs? Absolutely. You look at the traffic on Murdoch-related videos, through the roof. We try to get people to eat their vegetables and other stories. No, give us the Murdochs. And that's great. But do not ever, for a second, think that we're going to stop calling balls and strikes. Do not ever think for a second we're going to look anywhere but the evidence as we best know it and as we best bring it to you, our audience. And last but not least, instead of muting and blocking and trolling and attacking the people that disagree with us, we turn our microphone over to them. And we always will, because that is what this news outlet is dedicated to above all else. It is the marketplace of ideas, and that goes for the Murdochs, and that goes for some of the other stories we're going to tell you about right now. So we're talking about the stories that we've been covering in the aftermath of the big Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. One of the big ones, the Rose Petal murder. Now, this is a story, a graphic homicide up in Greenville, South Carolina, one that is scheduled for trial in the early part of 2024, but we've been covering that story in detail. Also, the Rockstar Cheer saga. This is a scandal that blew up into a nationwide case, a flood of lawsuits across the country targeting some of the biggest institutional names in that competitive cheer world. FITSNews driving both of those stories. But one of the things I wanted to focus your attention on today is a story also out of Greenville, South Carolina, Thornblade. Now, if you're a regular member of our audience, you know about this story. Back in the summer of 2020, this news outlet received a tip about some financial irregularities at the Thornblade Club. Now, this is a ritzy upscale golf club located in a ritzy upscale neighborhood in Greer, South Carolina. It's about 5 miles west of Greenville, South Carolina. But this is a club, again, we'd heard there were some financial issues, some irregularities. We started investigating those, and before long, we realized the real story at Thornblade wasn't these financial issues, but rather allegations of a sex ring, a prostitution ring, involving a group known as the 12 Disciples, some very powerful men from Greenville that were allegedly paying for sex as part of this sex ring, prostitution ring that was run through that country club. Now, as we began to investigate this, we learned that there were state investigations, there were local investigations, and there was even a federal probe launched by the Department of Homeland Security's HSI Homeland Security Investigations Unit. And what they were focused on were some allegations of human trafficking. But this story just was huge in Greenville. They were making bumper stickers on it, where people would send us stickers with, they called it Pornblade in Greenville, right? They would send us these stickers with Pornblade on them. I think we got one there. You could see it. But just a huge interest in the story in the upstate. But then it literally, as quickly as it came, it vanished. The story was gone. And so what we found, we've done a few follow-up reports since 2021. In fact, the last one was back in September of last year, and we talked about why this story disappeared. And there was a couple things. Number one, a lot of people signed some NDAs and got paid a lot of money not to talk. So that's the first thing. But again, that only solves things on the civil side. What happened to the criminal side? Well, what we were able to discover, or what we learned, what we did discover, was that investigators were unable to prove anything other than consensual sexual activity involving some of these alleged sex prostitution rings. They weren't able to find any underage sex. Everyone involved was above the age of consent, which in South Carolina is above the age of 16. And so I was told very bluntly by several of the prosecutors, both federal and state level, there's nothing we can do. Does it look bad? Yes. Is it, odd? Is it a little bit, off color, whatever? Yes, but nothing criminal. Nothing criminal. So Thornblade has been quiet. It's been quiet for a long time. But this past week, there was a news report, Channel 4, WYFF in Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, a news report detailing the suspension, according to WYFF, of an individual named Jody Gallagher. Now, Jody Gallagher, for the last several decades, has been the president and chief executive officer of AFL Global. Now, AFL Global, big fiber optic telecom company based up there in Greenville, South Carolina, in that area. It's a Japanese-owned company, and Gallagher was a huge force in that company. Not only is he the longtime president, chief executive officer, he's also a member of the board of the parent company in Japan, the first and only American member of that board. So just a huge figure in that company. But early last month, Gallagher was reportedly escorted from AFL Global based on an internal whistleblower investigation. Now, this was not made public again until YFF reported on his suspension. We have since learned that suspension was not a suspension, it was a resignation. And on June 6th of this year, just this past week, the company announced that it had hired a new president. So you're probably wondering at this point, okay, what does this have to do with Thornblade? I'll tell you. According to a confidential dossier that was provided to federal and state and local investigators, Gallagher was one of the names on that list of the 12 disciples. Now, does this mean he was involved in a sex ring, folks? Does it mean he was involved in prostitution activity? Does it mean any of those things? No. Merely an allegation that was made to those investigators. Now, we do know Gallagher was a longtime board member at Thornblade. In fact, he was the president of the Thornblade Club for 3 years. So there are connections there to the club, obviously connections to that neighborhood, but does that mean that it's true? Again, we don't know. But we are told that there is a federal investigation in the aftermath of Gallagher's, again, suspension, resignation, whatever you want to call it, firing. We don't know for sure exactly what happened. We have not heard from AFL Global on what it contends led to his departure. We do know there was a letter from the CEO of that, or rather the parent company, indicating that he was no longer employed in any way, shape, or form with the company. But the circumstances aren't entirely clear. But we do know a federal inquiry underway in the aftermath of his resignation. Will that lead us back into Thornblade? It's possible. It's possible. But I want you to know this news outlet will continue to follow that story of Jody Gallagher's abrupt and, from all indications, forced exit from AFL Global, one of the bigger, most influential companies up in Greenville. In fact, this guy repeatedly named one of the most influential business leaders in Greenville, just like all the folks on that dossier, by the way. But I want you to count on FITSNews. If there's a Thornblade connection to this, we can uncover. We are going to be pulling those threads as we continue to investigate the Jody Gallagher resignation from AFL and its possible connection to that Thornblade saga that so captivated the upstate back in 2020. So as South Carolina begins to look toward 2024 and the first in the South Republican presidential primary and the first in the nation Democratic primary, there were a ton of developments this past week. Obviously the biggest one, the most significant nationally, the latest indictment of former U.S. President Donald Trump. This time it's a federal indictment, and it's based on those classified documents which were found in his possession down at Mar-a-Lago. Justice Department filing several charges against him on those. We're still waiting for those indictments to be unsealed. However, we do know that, again, this is related to something basically identical to what Joe Biden's been accused of doing with the documents that were found in his garage. In fact, there's a ton of former presidents, former government officials who leave office and they have these documents with them. Anyway, they've indicted Trump. This is the second indictment against the former president. Previously, he was indicted by a Manhattan district attorney in connection with hush money payments to multiple mistresses, including porn star Stormy Daniels. But we've also got potential looming indictments against Trump. There's a grand jury in Atlanta, Georgia, probing his alleged involvement in attempting to swing that election in the state of Georgia, the electoral votes there that were so pivotal to Biden's victory, but also the big one, the January 6th rioting at the U.S. Capitol. There's an investigation there. Those would also be federal charges in the event any are filed. But Trump, let's be honest, the last indictment involving the charges of hush money payments helped him. In fact, they propelled him to a level of support not seen in many months. In fact, Trump actually was briefly higher than where he was before the November elections, when he was viewed by many as being a reason for the Republicans' red wave not materializing. But Trump, in the aftermath of that first round of indictments by the Manhattan DA, just soared. Meanwhile, his top rival, Ron DeSantis of Florida, dipped down a bit. So there was a real spread there. Trump had been ahead of DeSantis by approximately 15 or so percent if you look at the composite polling from Real Clear Politics. But after that indictment, that ballooned, a 30-point spread. So what will be the effect of this indictment? We do not know. We're going to continue to follow it. Again, a lot will depend on what that indictment actually says. And again, a lot's going to depend on whether or not Trump gets indicted further in the Georgia case and the January 6th case. But as we look at that, one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly, you've got Ron DeSantis waiting there in the wings. He's polling about 20% nationally, polling about 20% in some of these early voting states, including South Carolina. But at the time of Trump's indictment, I'm telling you, DeSantis riding some momentum, some big momentum. This is a guy who, in the aftermath of the November elections, when Trump was at his weakest, and DeSantis surged to a huge victory down there in Florida, one that was powered by independents, powered by Hispanic voters, the kind of coalition that Republicans are desperate to have at the national level in 2024. DeSantis had it. It was being looked at as the future, they called him. It was Trump versus the future. That was the equation that GOP politicians were looking at. But a lot of that momentum ebbed for DeSantis. And when Trump was indicted, again, and successfully able to portray that indictment as a political witch hunt, as persecution, those numbers turned around and DeSantis began to struggle. But I saw DeSantis for the first time this past week in Gilbert, South Carolina. And I got to say, I was impressed. Don't agree with him on everything, but was impressed. I've been told that this guy had no personality. I did not see that at this rally. In fact, when DeSantis interrupted by a protester, he was shouting down that protester louder than any of the GOP activists in attendance, giving them the business. So I was impressed. And also, you can't really, well, you can, but it's difficult to fake the sort of authentic crowd energy that DeSantis had on his latest swing through South Carolina. He drew 3,000 plus people at stops in Bluffton and Gilbert, where I saw him, and then up in Greenville. Just huge energy at that Gilbert crowd, people, and that was the smallest of the crowds. So positive developments for DeSantis, but it's a hugely uphill climb. A hugely uphill climb. I've talked to operatives in multiple early primary states. We met a lot of them on our recent trip to the U.S.-Mexican border. But here in South Carolina, at least a quarter of that GOP primary vote, count it out. It's on lockdown for Donald Trump. On lockdown. So you're competing for the remaining 3/4 of that vote. Trump's going to get a chunk of that. How do you beat him? How do you beat him? And how do you beat him particularly when indictments, criminal indictments, actually improve his standing in the polls? That is the definition of being bulletproof politically. And as well as Ron DeSantis has been performing lately, how do you fight an opponent who literally the worst thing that can happen, boosts them in the polls? Boosts them in the polls. Well, while DeSantis fights for that, again, lane to victory against Trump, beneath him on the polling indexes, you got a bunch of other Republicans trying to find a lane for victory. 3 of them actually entered the race this week. 3 new candidates, including former Vice President Mike Pence, jumped in the race. But it's one of these, again, I don't know, second tier, let's call them second tier candidates, because if you're polling in single digits, folks, in this race, you're a second tier candidate. But one of those second tier candidates is South Carolina's own Tim Scott. And there was a moment that happened this past week that I think is one of the more significant developments in this case. And it was one of those things where there's a lot of stuff I plan to write. There's a lot of stuff that we editorial calendar it out. But sometimes things happen, you just see it, and you have to stop. I had to stop and immediately write about it because it was just such an incredible moment. Tim Scott went on a show called The View, which, again, I don't watch it. It's on ABC. I'm told it's basically the pablum of the vanguard of current thought, the woke apologists, the the new orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it. But it's a show where essentially every leftist, the climate change, whatever you want, every leftist impulse is advanced. But Scott goes on this show to respond to comments that were made about him as a black American. And in fact, they told Scott, stop talking about race issues. You're not allowed to talk about race issues in this country because you're an exception, you're not the rule. And so they criticized him very, very aggressively. But Scott went on the show, and I just had to read this because I'm a big West Wing fan. I'm a huge fan of Aaron Sorkin, the screenwriter for that show, because it was the sort of uplifting rhetoric that you just haven't heard in this country really since John F. Kennedy. You really haven't had anybody since John F. Kennedy that could just inspire people with an optimistic vision for the future of our country. But there was a moment in this interview with Tim Scott, and I wanted to read this because it's a quote that really just hit me. He was talking about this issue of race and how he wasn't supposed to talk about it because he's the exception. And here's what he said. Progress in America is palpable. It can be measured in generations. I look back at the fact that my grandfather, born in 1921 in Sally, South Carolina, when he was on a sidewalk and a white person was approaching, he had to step off and not make eye contact. That man believed then, with some doubt now, in the goodness of America, because he believed that having faith in God, faith in himself, and faith in what the future could hold for his kids would unleash opportunities in ways you cannot imagine. His grandson is a U.S. Senator, the first U.S. Senator, black U.S. Senator from the South since Reconstruction, which I think is pretty amazing. And I think that Tim Scott's ability not to get mad, we talked earlier in this show about people get so upset about criticism. That is how you handle it, people. That is how you handle it, with innate goodness, with eloquence, and with just that optimism. Again, I don't know if there's a lane for that in our modern political world. I don't think Tim Scott's going to be the Republican presidential nominee. He's polling at 1.6% nationally if you look at the numbers. But we need more of that in this discussion. And we sure as hell need more of that in responses to criticism, because if everybody can handle criticism like that, we're going to be moving to a much more evolved marketplace of ideas. But again, I wanted to point that out, not only for the way that Tim Scott handled it, but the fact that we are finally at a point in America where some of this, again, divisive, race-based hate coming from all sides, and that's what we need to remember. It's wrong no matter where it's coming from. No matter where it's coming from. But we're finally getting to a point where people can talk about it and challenge those mainstream corporate narratives. Now, before we break on this political segment, speaking of challenging the mainstream political corporate narratives, that's happening in a huge way in the person of Tucker Carlson. Now, I've never been a huge Tucker Carlson fan. I remember when he wore the bow tie, and I've never really watched his show on Fox. Watched it from time to time when he talked about certain South Carolina elected officials, but I have started watching him now that he's moved off of that mainstream platform. I actually was kicked off of it, fired by Fox News. And why was he fired? Well, it sure looks like he was fired because he wasn't, again, towing that corporate line. Because Fox, I know everyone likes to think Fox is the conservative out. They're just as bad. They're just as bad. It's all about pulling people to the polls and keeping them divided, propping up that two-party construct, that false dichotomy. That's what Fox is every bit as guilty of that as CNN. But Tucker Carlson has got his own thing going now on Twitter, and his first shot out of the gate, or at least the first one I watched anyway, absolutely brilliant. And it talked about some of the stuff that this news outlet's been screaming for years about the conflict in Ukraine and about how it is nothing but a neoconservative attempt to drag this country into World War III. And in that segment, Carlson called out a couple South Carolina politicians who are the most prominent one of them the most powerful, one of the most very influential tools of those neoconservatives, Lindsey Graham. But Carlson called out Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley, and I wanted to cut real quick to that segment because it was so powerful. Let's take a listen.
This morning, it looks like somebody blew up the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine. The rushing wall of water wiped out entire villages, destroyed a critical hydropower plant, and as of tonight, puts the largest nuclear reactor in Europe in danger of melting down. So, if this was intentional, it was not a military tactic, it was an act of terrorism. The question is, who did it? Well, let's see. The Kakhovka Dam was effectively Russian. It was built by the Russian government. It currently sits in Russian-controlled territory. The dam's reservoir supplies water to Crimea, which has been, for the last 240 years, home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Blowing up the dam may be bad for Ukraine, but it hurts Russia more. And for precisely that reason, the Ukrainian government has considered destroying it. In December, the Washington Post quoted a Ukrainian general saying his men had fired American-made rockets at the dam's floodgate as a test strike. So really, once the facts start coming in, it becomes much less of a mystery what might have happened to the dam. Any fair person would conclude that the Ukrainians probably blew it up, just as you would assume they blew up Nord Stream, the Russian natural gas pipeline, last fall. And in fact, the Ukrainians did do that, as we now know. It's not like Vladimir Putin is anxious to wage war on himself. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Mr. and Mrs. Cable News consumer. Vladimir Putin is exactly that sort of man, the sort of man who'd shoot himself to death in order to annoy you. We know this from the American media, which wasted no time this morning in accusing the Russians of sabotaging their own infrastructure. Bill Kristol, the man who once told us that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, immediately denounced Putin as a war criminal and even more savagely compared him to Donald Trump. The rest of the pundit class made similar, clearly coordinated noises. Putin did it! Putin did it! And their reasoning was simple. Putin is evil, and evil people do evil things purely for the dark joy of being evil. In this specific case, Putin attacked himself, which is the most evil thing you can do, and therefore perfectly in character for a man that evil. That was their explanation. No one who's paid to cover these things seemed to entertain even the possibility it could have been the Ukrainians who did it. No chance of that. Ukraine, as you may have heard, is led by a man called Zelensky. And we can say for a dead certain fact that he was not involved. He couldn't have been. Zelensky is too decent for terrorism. Now, you see him on television, and it's true you might form a different impression. Sweaty and rat-like, a comedian turned oligarch, a persecutor of Christians, a friend of BlackRock. But don't believe your own eyes. Actually, Mr. Zelensky is a very good man. The best, really. As George W. Bush once noted, he is our generation's Winston Churchill. Of all the people in the world, our shifty, dead-eyed Ukrainian friend in the tracksuit is uniquely incapable of blowing up a dam. He's literally a living saint, a man in whom there is no sin. That's why Lindsey Graham is so attracted to him. They're just two good people, hanging out together and being good. And like all good people, when they meet in person, they spend a lot of time talking about killing people and laughing like friends do. Here's the pair last week.
Free or die.
Free or die.
Now you are free.
Yes.
And we will be.
And the Russians are dying.
It's the best money we've ever spent.
Thank you so much.
No.
Well, that's just amazing, folks. And if Tucker Carlson is going to be delivering that kind of content, I'm in. I'm all in. He can wear a bow, go back to wear the bow tie. I'm in. But as we look at this, this is significant because you're talking about one of the most popular cable news hosts in ever, now staking out this platform for himself, where he is guided not by what he's told to say on a teleprompter or a script, kind of like the President of the United States, right? No. He's going where the truth leads him. And that is something we need to be incredibly supportive of, because that is what the marketplace of ideas is all about. We talked about it earlier in the show as it related to the Murdochs. We're talking about it now on a much bigger stage. But as we look at this sort of threat to the establishment, it's not just Tucker Carlson and his show. We've got a potential third-party presidential campaign that could be a huge threat. And I'm talking about U.S. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Manchin has always been a independent guy. He's leaned a little bit toward the Republican side. Now, he's been with Democrats on some of the key votes. He's never going to break ranks completely when they've got like a nominee they've got to pass, or, he's never going to go completely off the reservation, but could be moving toward such a break with this no labels movement. Now, if you've heard of no labels, this is a group that purports to believe in, well, no labels, breaking out of that Republican, Democrat, red pill, blue pill. Again, I called it false dichotomy, false choice. Now, Manchin is reportedly very serious about running for president on the no labels third-party ticket. And if that happens, watch out. We could see the biggest third-party turnout since Ross Perot back in 1992. And that was an election that swung the vote to Bill Clinton, that cost George H.W. Bush the White House. Now, this time, we could see the reverse of that. Because if Joe Manchin runs on that no labels ticket, all indications are it is not going to hurt whoever the Republican nominee is, whether it's Donald Trump if he survives the indictments, Ron DeSantis, or any one of these other contenders. It will more than likely be the end of the administration of Joe Biden if Joe Manchin runs on that no labels ticket. Now, will he do it? I have spoken personally with several folks who are very influential in that no labels movement. And by the way, not Joe Cunningham, because they hadn't heard of them. All right? Joe Cunningham goes out in a post and concur with his no labels spiel. National people hadn't even heard of him. I'm talking about folks at the national level who are on those donor calls, who are raising the big dollars for this group. And they tell me Manchin is for real. Manchin is serious. He's going to run. So again, something to keep an eye out. And we will be keeping an eye out, by the way. If you haven't already, you got to check out FITSNews Political Stock Index. There's that awesome graphic. I compile that every week along with Mark Powell, who just does such a great job on that. But we will be bringing you an update this week, as we do every week, on where you should invest your political capital ahead of the 2024 election. But once again, count on FITSNews. We've got so many South Carolina folks in this race, so many South Carolina people making national attention. First in the South, Republican. First in the nation, Democrat. You want to know what's happening in the Palmetto State in both of those key primaries? Keep it tuned right here to FITSNews. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. Obviously, a ton of stuff that we covered this week, but I want to point you to a project that's coming up in the next couple weeks. Looking for middle of July, late July, somewhere in there, we are going to be launching a new podcast here on FITSNews. We call it Fits Files, and you may have heard a few of the subjects of that in this episode that we'll be digging into in more detail in that. And that's going to be a project led by Dylan Nolan, our Director of Special Projects, and Jen Wood, our Research Director. By the way, those were the driving force behind our Cheer Incorporated podcast and Cheer Incorporated coverage. You heard us talking about that earlier in the second segment today. So be on the lookout in the next few weeks for Fits Files, which is going to be our true crime podcast experience for you as we continue to expand our offerings here at FITSNews. We will catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Week in Review.